This is the Tiffany Jacket Sew Along, pattern designed by Retro Sparkle Designs, video created by Kiara D. Let's start with cutting out our pattern pieces. Make sure that your fabric has the required amount of stretch needed for the pattern. And if you're using a fabric that has a directional print, that it's facing the right way. Also make sure that your grain line is opposite of your stretch. Cut out all the required pieces that are listed in the pattern instructions. This pattern is intended for knit fabrics. For my version, I'm using a custom printed waffle knit fabric. I'm also using my projector to cut out my pattern pieces. If you are using paper and printing instead, make sure that your paper size is set to 8.5 by 11 inches and your scale is set to 100% or default. Make sure to check your test square and ensure it is 1 by 1 inches and use the instructions to tape your pattern pieces. After cutting out all the required pattern pieces, you should have 4 front pieces, 2 main and 2 lining, 2 back pieces, 1 main, 1 lining, 4 pocket pieces, 2 collar pieces, and 2 sleeves. The next step is to place your front lining panels right sides together to your lining back piece and sew at both shoulders. You repeat this step with your main pattern pieces. Use a serger to create the shoulder seams, or sew with the sewing machine using a stretch stitch. Use pins or clips to keep your pattern pieces together while sewing as needed. Once you've completed both shoulder seams on your lining and your main fabric pieces, set these 2 pieces aside. Next, we're going to place our collar pieces right sides together and sew around the entire top curve. We'll make sure to leave the lower sides and the bottom left unsewn. Once we're finished sewing, we're going to turn our collar right sides out to prepare for the next step. Now with our collar right sides out, we're going to take the lower edge that we left unsewn and line it up to the curve of the collar on the front lining piece. There should be about an inch in the front where the collar doesn't touch. Then take your main fabric body and place it right sides together with your lining, sandwiching the collar in between. Then we'll sew right here on this straight line. Sew or serge from the front edge, where just your main and lining fabrics are touching, to the corner where your collar is sandwiched in between, making sure that the collar is in place. After we finished with one side, we're going to do the same thing with the other side. Here's another view of where I'm placing the collar and lining it up with the corner of the front lining piece. And then I'm taking the main fabric body and sandwiching the collar in between. After sewing both sides, the collar and jacket should look like this. There should be about 1 inch in the front where the collar is not sandwiched in between the front and lining pieces. Now we're ready to sew the rest of the collar onto our jacket. To do this, we're going to sandwich the collar in between the lining and main fabric pieces, all the way along that entire curve of the neck. Pin or clip as needed to ensure that when you're sewing through 4 layers of fabric. You should be sewing through the lining, both layers of the collar, and the main during this step to fully attach the collar. Now that our collar is completely attached to our jacket, we're ready to move on to attaching our pocket pieces. Using the placement markings on the pattern pieces, we're going to place our pockets face down, right sides together, with our back main and our front main pattern pieces, making sure that the top edge and the side edge are the straight edges of our pockets. Do this with both sides of the back and both sides of the front main fabric. Then we'll sew straight down, attaching the sides of the pocket. Make sure that your lining fabric is kept out of the way and you're only attaching your pocket pieces to your main front and main back fabric of your jacket. Once our pockets are attached to our main fabric of our jacket, we're ready to move on to our sleeves. To attach the sleeve to the jacket, we're going to be sewing through the lining, the main, and the sleeve fabric. Place it right sides facing, and you'll sew all the way along the arm side. Repeat with both sides, attaching both sleeves to the jacket. Once both sleeves are attached, we're going to move on to closing the front edge of our jacket. To do this, we're going to take the lining and the main fabric of the front piece and place them right sides together. Then you'll sew straight down, starting from the top all the way to the bottom, closing that front edge of the jacket, and you'll do this to both sides. Here I'm just showing the same thing, but another angle, because this part can get a little tricky. So I'm taking the front, main, and lining, and sewing down the front side, which is the side that the pocket is not attached to. And in doing so, I'm closing that front seam of the jacket on both sides. So after I complete one side, I'll do the same thing with the other. Now we're going to sew the side seams. To do this, we're going to place our main front to our main back right sides together, clip or pin, and sew all the way down the arm, the curve of the pocket, and all the way to the bottom, making sure we keep our lining out of the way. When we're sewing, we're just sewing our front main and our back main fabrics together. After you've done this on one side, we're going to do the same thing on the other side, making sure that we sew carefully around the curve of the pocket and that we keep the lining fabrics out of the way. Now we'll sew the side seam of our lining fabric together. To do that, we'll take the back lining piece with our front lining piece and place them right sides together along that side seam, and we'll sew straight down. Here's another angle showing the same thing. We're just closing that lining side seam. So we're putting the lining fabric right sides together and sewing down that side seam, starting at the armpit and all the way to the bottom. When you finish sewing one side, we'll repeat with the other. It's time to close the bottom of the jacket. To do this, we're gonna turn the jacket inside out. This is also called the burrito roll method. So we'll basically take the entire jacket and close it inside itself, placing the main fabric and the lining fabric right sides together across the bottom. Then we'll sew across the bottom, leaving a 2 to 3 inch gap so that we're able to pull the jacket through. Make sure that as you're sewing, your seams line up and that you don't forget to leave that 2 to 3 inch gap. After you're done sewing, find that hole that was created by leaving that 2 to 3 inch gap and pull the entire jacket through the hole. Once your jacket is turned all the way out, all that's left is to sew up that gap and hem the sleeves. To do this, we'll just fold it under at the bottom and sew straight across with our sewing machine. Hem the sleeves with your desired method and your jacket's complete.